Why?
Did you have any thoughts about something? Was you wanting to go anywhere?
Were you happy when you found out you weren't going to go to the gas chamber, Charles?
I knew I wasn't going to go to the gas chamber because I hadn't done anything wrong.
You scared to die?
Sometimes I feel I'm scared to live.
On the night of August 8th, 1969, Charles Manson sent 4 of his followers to a house in the hills above Los Angeles and told them to kill everyone inside. He told them to do it as gruesome as you can. He did not go himself. He had been to that house before. He knew the property, knew the gate, knew the approach. He had stood in the living room of 10,050 Cielo Drive and spoken to the man who lived there, Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, the music producer who had listened to Manson's music and decided not to produce it. That conversation had happened months earlier. Melcher had since moved out. The house had been rented to Roman Polanski, the film director, who was himself in London. His wife, the actress Sharon Tate, was using the house. She was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant with their first child. She had invited 4 friends for dinner that evening. Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist who had once been her boyfriend and remained a close friend. Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish screenwriter and friend of Polanski's. Abigail Folger, Frykowski's girlfriend who was the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. And Stephen Parent, 18 years old, a young man who had no connection to the household's social world and who had been visiting the property's caretaker in a guest house at the rear of the property and who was driving away when the 4 Manson family members arrived. They cut the telephone wires at the top of the hill before entering. What happened inside the house took approximately 45 minutes. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel killed 5 people. Linda Kasabian, who had driven the car and was waiting outside, later testified that she heard the screaming from the road and that it did not stop for a long time. Sharon Tate was the last to die. She had watched her friends be killed. She pleaded with Atkins, told her about the baby, asked to be allowed to live long enough for the child to be born, offered to be taken hostage. Atkins later told her jail cellmate, without apparent distress, that she had looked Tate in the eyes and said, "I don't care about you, bitch." She stabbed her 16 times. As the 4 left the house, Atkins used Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door. They drove back to Spahn Ranch. Manson was waiting. The following night, Manson drove with a larger group to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. He had selected the house partly because he knew the neighborhood from having attended a party at the house next door. He and Tex Watson went inside, tied up the LaBiancas, and Manson then left. Left 3 of his followers in the house with the bound couple and drove away. He drove to other locations that night. He approached people in cars at various stops. He eventually returned to the ranch at dawn without having committed any additional violence himself. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were stabbed to death. Leno 41 times, Rosemary 52 times. The word rise was written on a wall in their blood. Death to pigs on another wall. Helter Skelter, misspelled, on the refrigerator door. Charles Manson did not kill anyone on either of those nights. He was not charged with killing anyone. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, with ordering the killings, with creating the ideological and psychological framework that made the killings possible, with sending people he had shaped into instruments to do what he told them. He was convicted on all counts. And he is, to this day, the most famous person in the history of American criminal justice who never personally killed anyone. How that happened, how a small-time career criminal from Cincinnati who had spent half his life in reform schools and prisons became, in the summer of 1969, the person who could send young women to commit mass murder in the Hollywood Hills and have them come back afterward and wait for his next instructions, is one of the most studied and least fully explained phenomena in the history of American crime. This is the story of Charles Manson. To understand what happened in August of 1969, you have to understand what August of 1969 in Los Angeles was. It was the specific end of something. The counterculture was at its peak and beginning to fracture. Vietnam was grinding forward. Woodstock was 2 weeks away. The moon landing had happened 3 weeks earlier. The neighborhoods of Los Angeles, the canyons, the Sunset Strip, the hills above Hollywood, had an energy that felt from inside it like the center of the world. The house at 10,050 Cielo Drive was at the top of a private road in Benedict Canyon, gated, secluded, with a view of the lit city below. Sharon Tate was 26 years old, carrying her first child, due in 11 days. Her husband, Roman Polanski, was in London finishing a film. She was using the house with friends, waiting for the summer to end and him to come back. She had no reason to expect what was coming. Nobody in that house did. Charles Mills Manson was born on November the 12th, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His birth certificate, for the first several weeks of his life, listed his name as No Name Maddox. His mother was Kathleen Maddox, who was 16 years old. His father was a man named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott. Not an actual colonel, just a drifter from Kentucky who had adopted the title as an affectation, who was gone before Manson was born and who Manson never met. Kathleen subsequently married a man named William Manson, whose surname she gave to the child, and who was also gone within a few years. Kathleen Maddox was 16 when she had Charles, and was not equipped to be a mother in any conventional sense. Not because she was cruel, but because she was a teenager herself, without money or stability, or any of the resources that parenting requires. She drank. She moved constantly. She was not consistently present. The account that Manson gave throughout his life of his mother was that she sold him for a pitcher of beer to a waitress when he was very young, handed the boy over to a stranger in exchange for alcohol. This story circulated widely and was treated as established fact in much of the popular coverage of his case. It may be true. It may be an elaboration, a mythologized version of neglect that was terrible enough without the embellishment. His mother, in a 1971 interview, said she was simply a dumb kid who had made bad decisions. She did not confirm the pitcher of beer story. What is documented is that in 1939, when Charles was 5 years old, Kathleen and her brother robbed a service station attendant. She was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Charles went to live with an aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia, a small town on the Ohio River. The aunt was deeply religious. The uncle was deeply harsh. Charles attended school, wore the clothes they provided, slept under their roof, and was, by his own later account, profoundly unhappy. He wanted his mother. His mother was in prison. Kathleen was paroled in 1942 and retrieved her son. What followed was several years of Midwestern drift, cheap rooms in Indianapolis, then Wheeling, then back to Cincinnati. Kathleen working occasionally, drinking more than occasionally, Charles running the streets of whatever neighborhood they occupied, developing the skills of the self-reliant and unsupervised child. He stole. He lied. He charmed adults who didn't know him and terrorized other children who did. He learned early that the easiest way through any situation was to make the other person feel that you understood them. By 1947, when he was 12 years old, Kathleen had decided she could not manage him anymore. She enrolled him in the Gibault School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a Catholic reform school for delinquent youth whose methods were more punitive than therapeutic. Charles ran away within a year. He broke into a grocery store and stole what he needed, was caught, and was sent to a different institution, the Indiana Boys School in Plainfield. He escaped from Indiana Boys School 18 times. He was 15 when he committed his first armed robbery, pointing a gun at someone and taking their money, the crime that turned him from a delinquent into something the system classified differently. He was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C., which conducted a battery of psychological and educational evaluations. The evaluations found that he had an above-average IQ, was illiterate. He had never been properly taught to read, and had developed what the psychologist described as a need to call attention to himself, combined with a tendency toward moodiness and a persecution complex. The evaluations also noted that he was a 16-year-old boy who has had no real home life. This observation, stated so plainly in a government document, is perhaps the most honest characterization of what had happened to Charles Manson up to that point. At 17, he was transferred to the Federal Reformatory at Petersburg, Virginia. He was raped by other inmates. He committed his first rape there, of a younger inmate at knife point. He was 23 when he was first released from federal prison after serving 3 years for various offenses. He was in and out of custody through his late 20s. In 1959, he was released again and immediately began running what investigators described as a prostitution operation, managing women, taking their earnings, moving between cities. He married twice during this period, had children he abandoned, and accumulated the evidence of a life organized around the exploitation of other people. In 1961, he was back in federal prison, sentenced to 10 years at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington state for multiple charges, including check forgery and Mann Act violations. He would serve 7 years. At McNeil Island, 2 things happened that would define the next phase of his life. The first was the guitar. He met Alvin Karpis, the former Public Enemy #1, the last surviving member of the Barker gang, then an elderly man serving out a life sentence who had time to sit and play and teach. Karpis taught Manson to play guitar. It turned out that Manson had a genuine facility for music, a pleasant voice, an instinctive feel for folk and country forms, an ability to write lyrics that had a raw emotional directness. He practiced constantly. He became, within the constraints of prison, something that nobody in his life had given him the opportunity to become, accomplished at something. The second was Scientology. The religious movement founded by L. Ron Hubbard had active recruitment at McNeil Island, and Manson engaged with it seriously, studying its techniques of mind unlocking, its theory of past life programming, its methods of identifying and removing the psychological barriers that prevented people from achieving their potential. He never became a Scientologist in any formal sense. What he absorbed was something more selective and more dangerous, a set of techniques for understanding how human minds organize themselves and how they could be reorganized by someone who knew what to look for. He was released in March of 1967. He asked the warden if he could stay. He was 32 years old, and he had spent 17 of those years in custody of one kind or another. The outside world was genuinely frightening, not because it was dangerous, but because it offered no structure, no rules, no clear set of relationships that he knew how to navigate. Prison, for all its brutality, was legible to him. He knew how it worked, and he knew who he was inside it. The warden told him he had to go. He went to San Francisco. It was the summer of love. The Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco in 1967 was the specific and extraordinary confluence of things that made Charles Manson possible. Young people, overwhelmingly white, many of them from comfortable middle-class backgrounds, were flooding into the neighborhood from across the country in pursuit of the specific promise of the counterculture: community, freedom, a rejection of the values and structures of the America they had grown up in. They were, many of them, in transit from something, from families that hadn't worked, from identities that didn't fit, from the ordinary structures of expectation that the 1950s had produced and that the 1960s was in the process of dismantling. They were also, many of them, in need of a father. Not literally, or not only literally. They were in need of the specific thing that a certain kind of charismatic male figure provides to people who have been inadequately fathered. Certainty, direction, the sense that someone knows the truth and can provide access to it. The counterculture had created a market for exactly this, and Manson, who had spent his entire adult life studying how to provide it, arrived in Haight-Ashbury in the spring of 1967 with no money, no possessions, and an exceptionally well-developed set of skills. He began gathering followers almost immediately. They were mostly young women. This was not accidental. Manson was specifically, surgically good at identifying young women who were in transit from difficult situations, who had left home angry or hurt or searching, who needed affirmation, who were susceptible to the specific combination of sexual attention and quasi-spiritual authority that he offered. He paid them total attention. He told them they were beautiful in ways that suggested he saw something in them that no one else had seen. He told them that the world had lied to them, their parents, their schools, the whole structure of American expectation, and that he could show them the truth beneath the lie. He gave them LSD. The doses he administered were not recreational. He gave LSD in quantities and frequencies, sometimes multiple trips a day, that in the research literature on psychedelics are associated with the dissolution of existing identity structures rather than the enhancement of experience. He gave it to people who were already in the process of leaving their previous selves behind, in a communal environment in which his voice was the constant, his interpretation was the framework, and his approval was the thing that mattered most. He told them they were dead. This was a specific technique, not a metaphor. He taught that the self they had arrived with was already dead, that they had crossed over into a new existence, and that the fears and inhibitions of the dead self no longer applied. This technique had a specific and documented effect. It made the people who accepted it capable of doing things they would not otherwise have been capable of, because the moral and social frameworks that would have prevented those things belonged to the dead self, not to the person they had become. He told them he was Jesus Christ. He did this gradually, beginning with the suggestion and building toward the statement in a way that allowed people who might have rejected the claim, if it had been made directly to arrive at it themselves, through a process that felt like discovery rather than instruction. He managed jealousy among the women. There were many of them, and they competed for his attention by teaching that jealousy was a form of the dead self's possessiveness, and that the truly liberated person had no attachment to such things. He made the capacity for jealousy into evidence of incomplete liberation, so that the women who experienced it had incentive to suppress it rather than express it. He taught absolute obedience, not as a rule, as a spiritual practice. To follow his instructions without questioning was, in the framework he had constructed, the same as being present in the moment, as having released the ego's need for control. Obedience was enlightenment. The family eventually settled at Spahn Ranch, an old movie lot in the Santa Susana Mountains, northwest of Los Angeles, used for years as a location for Western films, and now owned by an 80-year-old blind man named George Spahn. Manson provided Spahn with the company and attention of the family's young women, and Spahn in return allowed the group to live on the property. The weathered Western film sets, the saloon, the fake storefronts, the old corrals, created a landscape that was simultaneously theatrical and functional. The family lived in the structures, gathered around fires in the evenings while Manson played guitar and talked. There was always music. There was always LSD. There were always the talks that went on for hours and covered always the same territory. Manson's vision, the coming war, the specific role that each member of the family had in what was coming. The family at its peak numbered perhaps 35 people in the core group. They were overwhelmingly young and overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly from backgrounds that had, in one way or another, left them available for what Manson was offering. Patricia Krenwinkel had been a secretary. Susan Atkins had danced in a topless club. Leslie Van Houten had been a homecoming princess in her suburban high school. Charles Watson had been a college student and football player from Texas. None of them would have described themselves before Manson as people capable of murder. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Manson family. It was not populated by people who arrived already capable of what they eventually did. It was populated by people who were made capable of it gradually, through a process that took years and that was, in its mechanics, comprehensible, even if its outcomes were monstrous. The process worked in stages: the dissolution of the previous identity through LSD, and the constant message that the person they had been was dead. The construction of a new identity organized around the family and Manson's vision. The specific teachings about helter-skelter that provided the framework within which murder could be understood not as violence but as service. And finally, the testing. Small acts of transgression that, when completed, reinforced the capacity for larger ones. By the summer of 1969, several of the core family members were beyond the testing phase. Manson chose the moment. By 1968, the family had moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, where Manson pursued his music career. They lived for a time at Dennis Wilson's house on Sunset Boulevard. Wilson later estimated that the family's occupation of his property cost him over $100,000 in damage, expenses, and the need to get tested for gonorrhea. He was never publicly resentful about this, or not for long. Through Wilson, Manson met Terry Melcher. Melcher was the son of Doris Day, a music producer who had worked with the Byrds and whose industry connections were exactly what Manson needed. Melcher came to Spahn Ranch and listened to Manson play and sing. He came more than once. He did not offer a recording contract. The rejection did not produce rage in Manson, at least not visibly. What it produced in the following months was the acceleration of helter-skelter. The race war theory had been building for 2 years. The specific energy that the music rejection generated flowed into it. By the summer of 1969, the theory had a specific operational component. Manson and the family needed to trigger the war themselves because the war was not starting on its own. And they needed to do it in a way that would be attributed to black revolutionaries, leaving messages in blood at crime scenes that would enrage white America and produce the white-on-black backlash that Manson believed would destroy the existing order and leave him to rule in the aftermath. He had told this to the family so many times, under so many circumstances, with such certainty that several of the people closest to him had absorbed it entirely. They did not think they were being asked to kill people. They thought they were participating in the beginning of the end of the world and that they were on the right side of it. Susan Atkins, in jail a few months after the murders, told her cellmate about what they had done with no apparent shame or remorse, with pride, and with the specific excitement of a person who has been part of something important. She said that the killings were just the beginning. She said that Manson had a list of celebrities. She named Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Tom Jones, Steve McQueen, and Frank Sinatra, who were going to be killed next. She said this while sitting in a county jail dormitory to a woman she had known for approximately a week. That conversation was what unraveled everything. Helter-skelter was Manson's cosmology, the specific and elaborate belief system he had constructed and taught to the family over the preceding 2 years, drawing on the Beatles' White Album, the Book of Revelation, a theory of racial apocalypse, and his own position as the figure who understood what was coming and would lead his people through it. The theory had several components, each of which built on the others in a structure that was internally coherent, even if its relationship to observable reality was not. The first component was the race war. Manson believed, or taught, or both, that a war between white and black Americans was coming. He had read the writings of the Nation of Islam and various black power organizations with a specific interpretive lens, extracting from them the implication of coming violence rather than the political argument those organizations were making. He believed that black Americans were going to rise up against white Americans and kill them, and that this would happen soon. The second component was survival. The family, under Manson's leadership, would survive the race war by hiding in a bottomless pit. A system of caverns he believed he had identified somewhere beneath Death Valley, accessible through a hole in the desert floor. He led expeditions into Death Valley to find the entrance. The family spent time in the desert, in extreme heat, looking for a door to the underground world that Manson believed was there. The third component was the aftermath. After the race war, black Americans would find that they had won a world they did not know how to manage. They would look for guidance. Manson, emerging from the underground with his followers, would provide it. He would rule the world. He believed this. He had told it to the family so many times, under conditions of sleep deprivation and LSD and isolation from any corrective outside information, that several of the people closest to him had absorbed it as their operating framework for reality. The fourth component, added in the summer of 1969, was the trigger. The race war was not starting on its own. It needed to begin. And the way to begin it was to commit murders that would be attributed to black revolutionaries, to leave evidence at crime scenes designed to make the killings look like the work of the Black Panthers or similar organizations, provoking a white backlash that would ignite the war Manson had been predicting. This is why the messages were written in blood. Pig on the front door of the Tate House, the specific language that the Black Panther newspaper used to refer to police. Death to pigs and rise, and helter-skelter on the walls of the LaBianca house. These were not spontaneous expressions. They were designed, staged to produce a specific misattribution. The murders were a message. Manson was sending it to white America on behalf of black America in order to start a war between them. The Los Angeles Police Department, in the days immediately following the murders, did not understand any of this. They did not know about Manson. They did not know about the family. They had two sets of extraordinarily brutal murders, apparently unconnected, with messages written in blood that they could not explain. The city was afraid in a specific way that the coverage of the time captures but does not fully convey. The murders had happened in the most expensive and visible neighborhood in Los Angeles, in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, in the world of celebrity and money that the city understood as its protected class. Sharon Tate was 26 years old, beautiful, the wife of a celebrated film director, visibly pregnant. The violence that had reached her had come from nowhere identifiable and had left nothing that explained it. People in the hills hired security guards. They installed new locks and new alarm systems. They stopped going out at night. The social life of the Hollywood community, the parties, the casual gatherings that defined its culture, contracted sharply. Roman Polanski, in London when his wife was murdered, flew back to Los Angeles and gave interviews in a state of evident anguish. He stayed in the house for a period. He said later that this had been a mistake. The fear continued for 2 months while the investigation went nowhere. What broke it finally was the conversation Susan Atkins had in the county jail. The story she told to a woman she had just met, with no apparent awareness that this was not a safe thing to do, or with the specific confidence of a person who believed that the war had started and that its starting justified everything. That conversation, a 21-year-old woman talking in a dormitory, ended the most prolonged period of public terror that Los Angeles had experienced since the war. The investigation that followed was one of the most chaotic in Los Angeles history. LAPD investigators initially did not connect the Tate murders to the LaBianca murders the following night, even though both scenes contained messages written in blood and both used the word pigs. The .22 caliber revolver that one of the killers had thrown from the car was found by a 10-year-old boy in Sherman Oaks and turned over to the LAPD, who filed it without connecting it to the most publicized murder case in the city's history. The gun sat in an evidence room for 2 months. The case that was generating national hysteria, the murder of a beautiful actress 8.5 months pregnant with 4 other people in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, was not being solved. Los Angeles was afraid. Roman Polanski gave interviews in which he was clearly terrified. The wealthy residents of the hills hired security. The ordinary investigative machinery of the LAPD was not producing results. The break came not from investigation, but from a jail cell. Susan Atkins was in the Los Angeles County Jail in November of 1969, arrested in connection with the Spahn Ranch raid. She was placed in a dormitory with other women awaiting trial on various charges. She found herself talking to a woman named Virginia Graham, and the conversation moved, as conversations do in that environment, towards significant things. Atkins told Graham about the murders, in detail, with apparent pleasure, with the specific quality of someone who has been part of something important and cannot contain the importance. She described tasting Sharon Tate's blood. She described Tate's pleas for her life. She expressed no remorse. She said that the killings were the beginning, that there was more to come, that Manson had a list. Graham eventually reported the conversation to the LAPD. That was what broke the case. Not forensic analysis, not detective work. A 21-year-old woman talking in a county jail dormitory. Manson and the family members who had committed the murders were charged. The trial began in June of 1970 and became, over the following year, one of the most extraordinary spectacles in the history of the American legal system. Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. His response, he said, to being crossed out of the human race by society. The 3 female defendants, Atkins, Van Houten, and Krenwinkel, carved matching X's into their own foreheads the same day. They sat in the courtroom and stared, and occasionally laughed and exchanged glances with Manson. They sang together on the courthouse steps while waiting for proceedings to begin. They shaved their heads. They carved the X's deeper and eventually changed them to swastikas. The spectacle was deliberate and effective. It produced a specific impression of people who were beyond the reach of ordinary legal categories, who were not pretending to normalcy, who were not performing remorse, who seemed, to the observers watching them, to be genuinely outside the human framework that the courtroom was designed to operate within. Manson conducted his own defense for portions of the trial, which gave him a platform to deliver the performances he had been rehearsing his entire adult life. He was articulate and unpredictable in equal measure. He said things that were clearly designed to fascinate and destabilize, rather than to mount a legitimate legal defense. He said things that became widely quoted. "Look down at me, you see a fool. Look up at me, you see a god. Look straight at me, you see yourself." Lines that had the quality of prepared material, of a man who had been composing his trial persona for some time. The prosecution, led by Vincent Bugliosi, built its case around helter-skelter, around the argument that Manson had constructed and operated a belief system that made murder not only acceptable, but religiously mandatory for his followers. Bugliosi was making a novel legal argument, that you could be convicted of murders you had not committed, had not directed in specific terms, and had not been present for, if you had created the psychological conditions in which other people would commit them on your behalf. The jury agreed. On January the 25th, 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder on 7 counts and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to death. The 3 female defendants were similarly convicted and sentenced. In February of 1972, the California Supreme Court issued a ruling in People v. Anderson that found the death penalty as administered in California to be unconstitutional. All death sentences imposed before the ruling, including Manson's, were automatically commuted to life in prison. Charles Manson was not going to be executed. He was going to prison for the rest of his life. He was 37 years old. He had approximately 46 years left to live. He served all of them in prison, and he used every one of them to continue being Charles Manson. In prison, Manson gave interviews, dozens of them, over 4 decades, to journalists and documentarians and criminologists, and the merely curious who arranged access through the California Department of Corrections. He was a compelling interview subject because he was intelligent and articulate, and because he spoke about himself and his crimes in ways that were simultaneously forthcoming and evasive, giving enough to make the conversation feel revealing while never actually confessing to anything he hadn't already been convicted of. He said things that seemed designed to shock or fascinate rather than to explain. He applied for parole 12 times. He was denied 12 times. The parole board at each hearing received accounts from surviving victims and from the families of the dead, describing the ongoing damage of the murders to the people who had lived through them. At each hearing, the board decided that Manson continued to represent a threat to public safety. He attracted followers even from prison. People wrote to him, more people than any other prisoner in California by some accounts. The mail was substantial enough that it had to be managed and filtered. Among the letter writers were researchers and journalists with legitimate purposes, true crime enthusiasts, and a significant number of people who were attracted to Manson in the specific way that some people are attracted to power, even when the power is the power to cause destruction. He was famous, and he was dangerous, and he was imprisoned, and these things in combination produced a particular kind of appeal. One of the people who wrote to him was a young woman named Afton Elaine Burton, who had been corresponding with him since she was a teenager. She moved to California when she was older, settling near the prison in Corcoran. She and Manson obtained a marriage license in 2014 when she was 26 and he was 79. The marriage license expired after 90 days without a ceremony. There were reports that the wedding had been prevented by Manson's discovery that Burton's actual interest was in obtaining rights to his corpse, which she and an associate planned to put on display in a glass case after his death. Whether this account is accurate is unknown. What is known is that the marriage never happened. He maintained throughout his prison years the persona he had been building since 1969. He made statements like, "I've killed no one. I've ordered no one to be killed. These children who come to you with their knives, they're your children. I didn't teach them, you did." This statement, shifting responsibility to society while simultaneously claiming proximity to the killings, is typical of the way Manson spoke about his case for 4 decades. It was designed to be quoted. It was designed to sound profound. It was also, in its way, the specific deflection of a man who had spent his life making other people responsible for things that were his. He also recorded music from prison. Several albums of his recordings were released over the years under labels that operated on the margins of the music industry. As a convicted felon, he received no royalties from the sales. The money went into a victims' rights fund. He was, in the end, a musician whose recordings were commercially available, but from whom the commercial benefit had been legally removed. He died on November 19, 2017, in a hospital in Bakersfield, California, from cardiac arrest secondary to colon cancer. He was 83 years old. He had spent approximately 50 of those years in custody of one kind or another. His son successfully sued for the right to bury him. He is in a cemetery in Porterville, California. The Manson family members who committed the murders received life sentences. Their subsequent decades in prison produced stories of their own. Patricia Krenwinkel, who had helped kill 7 people across 2 nights in August 1969, was incarcerated for over 50 years. She was repeatedly recommended for parole and repeatedly denied. She described, in later years, the years it had taken to dismantle Manson's worldview from the inside, to reacquire in her 50s and 60s the capacity for ordinary moral judgment that he had spent 2 years dissolving. Leslie Van Houten had been 19 years old when she participated in the LaBianca murders. She was recommended for parole 19 times between 1978 and 2021. Each recommendation was blocked by the sitting California governor. She was finally released in 2023 at the age of 73, after having spent 53 years in prison. Charles Tex Watson, who had actually led the murders at both crime scenes, remains in prison. He was born again in prison and founded a prison ministry. He has been denied parole more than 30 times. Susan Atkins, who had told her cellmate the story that broke the case, and who had been the last person to speak to Sharon Tate before killing her, developed brain cancer in her final years and died in prison in 2009 at the age of 61. She had requested compassionate release. The California governor denied it. Linda Kasabian, who had driven the car on both nights and who turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity, received no prison time. She lived quietly for decades in New Hampshire. She died in 2023. Sharon Tate's parents founded a victims' rights organization and spent decades attending parole hearings and advocating for victims of violent crime. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, attended every parole hearing for the Manson family members who had killed her daughter for the rest of her life. She died in 1992. Sharon's father, Colonel Paul Tate, died in 2005. Sharon Tate was 26 years old. The baby she was carrying at the time of her death, a boy 11 days from his due date, was given the name Paul Richard Polanski and buried with her. The question that the Manson case has always generated, beyond the specific question of guilt, which the jury resolved in 1971, is the question of how. How does a person acquire the kind of authority over other people that allows him to send them to commit murders on his behalf? How do relatively ordinary young people, people with families, with educations, with the ordinary social equipment of mid-century American life, become the people who drove to a house in the Hollywood Hills and killed everyone inside because someone told them to? Understanding the mechanics requires understanding what daily life in the family was actually like. Not the dramatic moments that the trial coverage focused on, but the ordinary texture of existence at Spahn Ranch in 1968 and 1969. Every day began with Manson. He was, by multiple accounts, extraordinarily good at making people feel that he was paying total attention to them in a way that no one in their life had ever paid total attention to them. He remembered things they had told him. He asked follow-up questions. He made eye contact that lasted slightly longer than normal social convention required, in a way that produced the sensation of being genuinely seen. For people who had come to him from situations where they had felt unseen, invisible to parents, to teachers, to the institutions that had processed them, this quality of attention was intoxicating. He also, simultaneously, dismantled the sense of self that the attention was being directed at. The compliments he gave were about qualities he could also take back. You're so beautiful. When you're not in your head, you're so free. When you let yourself be. The conditional structure of his positive feedback meant that his followers were always slightly off balance, always in need of the next affirmation, always motivated to do what would produce his approval rather than his withdrawal. The LSD was central to this. Not recreational LSD, administered LSD in doses and frequencies chosen by Manson rather than by the person taking it, given at moments chosen for their psychological effect. Manson did not take LSD himself, or took it very rarely. He was the consistent presence while everyone around him was in chemically altered states, which gave him an enormous structural advantage. He was always the one who knew what was happening and could interpret it for people who did not. A terrifying experience on LSD became, in his interpretation, a breakthrough, the death of the old self, the beginning of liberation. An ecstatic experience became confirmation of the family's chosen status. He also, from the beginning, constructed a specific theological framework around himself. He never straightforwardly said, "I am Jesus Christ." He suggested it, implied it, told the story in ways that allowed his followers to arrive at the conclusion themselves, which made the conclusion feel like their own discovery rather than his claim. When someone pointed out a perceived similarity to Jesus, he deflected it, not quite denying it, but allowing the moment to settle without confirmation, which is more effective than confirmation. He was, in the assessment of researchers who have studied authoritarian religious movements, an exceptionally skilled practitioner of the techniques that such movements use. He was not unique in using them. Charismatic manipulators have used similar techniques throughout history. What made Manson unusual was the specific moment and the specific population he found, and the specific form the resulting violence took. The late 1960s counterculture had created a large population of young Americans who were in active flight from conventional structures, family, religion, education, career, without any particular destination in mind. They were searching, and Manson was available. He was available in the specific form of someone who had everything they were searching for and could share it. Certainty, community, meaning, freedom from the guilt and anxiety of the conventional world. By the time they understood what the certainty meant and what the freedom required, they were in too deep to see it clearly. Susan Atkins told the jury what the experience of being in the family felt like. "I never felt so loved in my life." She said this while on trial for stabbing a pregnant woman to death. Both things were true at the same time. That is perhaps the most important sentence in the entire Manson case. There were other murders before August 1969 that are part of the family's record. In late July of 1969, family member Bobby Beausoleil, accompanied by Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner, killed a man named Gary Hinman. Hinman was a music teacher and acquaintance of the family who Manson believed had recently inherited money he wanted. They held Hinman hostage for 3 days, demanding the money. Manson appeared at the house at one point and slashed Hinman's ear with a sword. When it became clear that Hinman did not have the money, Beausoleil killed him with a knife. Before leaving, he wrote "Political Piggy" on the wall in Hinman's blood and drew a Black Panther paw print beside it. This was the template, the racial messaging, the messages in blood. 2 weeks before Tate and LaBianca, Manson had established the pattern he intended to use. Beausoleil was caught driving Hinman's car 6 days later. He was arrested with a bloody knife. He was in jail when the Tate and LaBianca murders were committed. Investigators looking at the LaBianca and Tate crime scenes did not connect them to the Hinman murder, which was being handled by a different detective. 3 separate sets of murders, all with messages in blood, all committed by the same organization, were being investigated as unrelated cases. This failure of connection, across divisions within a single police department, across cases that had been open simultaneously for weeks, is part of what allowed the investigation to stall for 2 months. The family also killed a man named Donald Shea in late August of 1969 after the Tate and LaBianca murders. Shea was a ranch hand at Spahn Ranch who Manson believed had been cooperating with law enforcement. He was killed and his body was hidden in the hills above the ranch. It was not found for 4 years. 9 confirmed murders. Manson himself presented one, the Hinman murder, for the sword slash, and directing the others from a distance. He never held the knife, and that is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. He was no Name Maddox for the first weeks of his life. He died as Charles Manson. Everything that happened between those two facts was, in its way, a lesson in the specific and terrifying power of a person who has nothing, no family, no education, no legitimate prospects, no social standing, and who builds, from those materials, a world in which other people's lives belong to him. He built that world. 9 people died in it. He never pulled the trigger. Sharon Tate was 26 years old. Her son never had a name. The Manson murders are studied 56 years later, not only as a criminal case, but as a cultural event, as something that happened to America, not just to 9 people and their families. The murders are treated as the moment the 1960s ended, the specific act of violence that collapsed the decade's optimism and revealed something that had been inside the counterculture all along, or that had been adjacent to it and had taken advantage of it. This reading has been disputed. The counterculture was not responsible for Manson, was, in fact, the environment that made him possible, partly because it was suffused with genuine idealism that he exploited rather than embodied. The people who joined the family were not naive victims of some inherent darkness in the era's values. They were people in specific situations of vulnerability who encountered a specific and skilled manipulator. The same circumstances that made the Manson family possible would have made something else possible in any other era. But the reading has persisted because it serves a narrative purpose. It explains why the 1960s ended, why the optimism curdled, why the specific quality of that moment could not be sustained. The Manson murders provide a date for the ending. August 9th, 1969, the morning after. Before that morning, the decade was one thing. After it, something had changed. Joan Didion, who wrote about Los Angeles in that period with the precision of someone documenting a fever, described the murders as the point where she understood that the city's particular quality of unreality had a price. The specific quality of Los Angeles life in 1969, the privacy of the canyons, the gates, the sense that wealth and fame produced a kind of safety, had turned out to be illusory. Whatever had come to that house in the hills had come from inside the world it destroyed. Helter Skelter, Bugliosi's book about the trial, published in 1974, became the best-selling true crime book in American history to that point, and introduced the Manson mythology to a generation that had not experienced it in real time. It defined the public understanding of the case for decades and shaped, through subsequent films and television and documentaries and books, the way Manson is understood now. He died in 2017 still famous, still receiving mail, still the subject of annual documentaries and podcasts and academic papers and journalistic profiles. He had managed from prison to remain what he had always wanted to be, the center of attention. He had not become a famous musician. He had become something larger and worse, and the machinery of American celebrity had processed him with the same indifference it processes everything. His recordings are available on streaming platforms. The Victims' Rights Fund that receives the royalties has received very little money. He was convicted of 9 murders he did not personally commit. He never pulled the trigger. Sharon Tate's son never had a name. He would have been 56 years old this year.